Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. Thank you for the time that we've been able to spend around your table. We thank you for the reminders of your grace that you have shown us and giving us your Son to die for our sins and for the love that is shown there in that the amazing love. Mary, I pray that during this period of Bible study that you will open our hearts and that you will open our minds to learn more about you. Dear God, I pray that you will be with everything that is said this morning. Dear God, I pray that you'll be with our other teachers this morning. Pray that you'll be with those all over the world that are gathered today to praise you and to worship you and for all of the amazing things you've done for us. And it's through your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right. I've been tasked this morning with speaking about Lydia, Phoebe, and Dorcas. And on the surface, we probably all know who all three of these women are. And so it's not a big surprise as far as these characters and maybe what they did. The thing is that there's not a lot of information, as is with most of the characters, at least that I have left. There's not a lot of information left. But I think, hopefully this morning, what is mentioned about these women specifically will be impactful. And like we mentioned, I think when I was talking about Silas and Barnabas and Timothy, even though people may not gather as much space on a piece of paper or in literature, it doesn't mean that they had any less of an impact on where they were located and the people that they were surrounded by and their faith and what all they did to further God's kingdom. And so we'll go ahead and jump into Lydia this morning, and you can turn over to Acts chapter 16 if you want to begin over there. We'll kind of jump around between Acts and Romans. But Lydia was a lady from Thyatira originally, which is a province in Lydia, which would be modern-day Turkey now. So that gives you a little bit better idea of where that would be. But it was a region that was heavily known for its purple dye. And so hopefully everybody can see this map. But Thyatira is the blinking blue box up there in Asia. And Lydia would have been more of the region where Thyatira would have been located. But this is where Lydia, whether she was named from the region she was from or not, this is where she would have been from. And you can see its close proximity perhaps to the coast, which is going to be important here later. But like I said, an area that's known for its purple dye, and so she was a dealer in purple cloth and selling cloth, which would have made her likely an independent business owner, and who knows what her business model would have looked like, or who she would have had working for her, or who she would have employed or not. And we'll talk about some of the aspects of purple dye here in just a minute. But this would have made her very likely a wealthier individual within Philippi, just because of the cost of the purple dye and everything. Typically, purple robes and purple clothing only being sold to the upper echelon, the aristocrats of Roman society and wealthy. We're not really told why she moved from Thyatira over to Philippi. But I do want to briefly touch on why purple dye was so valuable and expensive. And so it comes from a murex snail, which is actually a predatory snail. I never knew any of this, so I thought it was pretty interesting. But it comes from the snail, and typically they're best harvested in the spring. And it was a prize dye, not just because of its amazing or brilliant color, but because that dye would not easily fade, and in some accounts would actually become a little more vibrant or brilliant when it was weathered and worn. And so it was a valuable dye. It was a dye that would hold up. But the reason that this dye cost so much is that it would take thousands and thousands of snails to be able to make even a tablespoon of the dye. And so somebody had, in looking through some information, somebody said it would take anywhere from 100,000 to 250,000 2,000 snails to produce a single tablespoon of the dye. So you imagine back then, they didn't have a process or a machine that went out and just sucked up all the snails in the ocean. You had to go out and hand collect all of those dyes, and that was just part of it. And then you had to salt the snails over a 3-day period, and then you boiled whatever came out of them. I don't know. They were purple guts. That was so valuable. But then they boiled them for 10 more days. And so you think about this being a very lengthy and tedious process. And the easy part was actually probably just putting the cloth into the dye and calling it done. The tedious part was getting to that point. And so because of that, it was very expensive. That's why it became more of a status symbol. If you remember, Jesus even was placed in had a purple robe placed on him before his crucifixion. But in our modern day money, and this goes back to around 300 AD, back in 300 AD, a pound of this dye, would have been around $66,000 for a pound of dye. And so whatever that would have equated to back in Lydia's time, if she was finding a lot of snails and extracting the purple guts right, then she was doing just fine for herself. But it was by 4th century AD in the Roman Empire that only the emperors were allowed to wear that Tyrian purple dye. And so there again, even elevating the status and the recognition for people who could afford and wear that. Anyway, so we see Lydia's from Thyatira. She's now living in Philippi. She deals in purple clothing. But she's mentioned just once in the Bible. And so if you turn over to Acts chapter 16, we see where she is mentioned. And let's pick up in verse 14. A woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple fabrics, a worshiper of God, was listening, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household had been baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and stay." And she prevailed upon us. And so you see just really two, actually even the third verse at the very end of chapter 16, when after Paul and Silas were in prison, they travel back to Lydia's house. But you see just these couple of verses that are mentioned here. But hopefully we can bring about the importance or the recognition of why she's mentioned. Like I mentioned, she was in Philippi. Thessalonica in Macedonia was actually a larger city. And Amphipolis was the capital of Macedonia, but Macedonia was still considered a leading city in Macedonia at the time because of where it's positioned. If you actually take a look up here at the map, if you take a look up here, Philippi is all the way up here. There's Thessalonica, Amphipolis, but you can see where Philippi would have been better positioned as kind of the crossroads between Europe and Asia from that standpoint. But the reason Lydia is mentioned is during Paul's second missionary journey. And so you see where earlier in chapter 16, you recall what Paul receives earlier in chapter 16, just a few verses before. What does he receive? He receives a vision, right? So he receives this vision. Yeah, he sees this vision. He has this Macedonian call, and it always seems like visions happen in the night for some reason. But he sees this vision of this Macedonian man pleading with him, appealing to him to come over and help us. And let's read Acts chapter 16 and verse 10. Acts chapter 16, beginning in verse 10. When he had seen the vision, that is Paul, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So putting out to sea from Troas, which is the blinking box up here on the screen, putting out to sea from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and on the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city in the district of Macedonia. a Roman colony, and we were staying in this city for some days. And on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to a riverside where we were supposing that there would be a place of prayer. And we sat down and began speaking to the women who had assembled. So there we see Philippi up there at the top. So what was Paul's typical strategy? Anytime he went into a new city, right? He would typically find the synagogue. Well, I'm assuming, and we can assume that there was not a synagogue here in Philippi, or if there was, it wasn't mentioned. So Paul goes to the next best place, right? To the riverside. And he sees this group of women that are gathered for prayer. And he begins to speak to them. And we see, as we've already read, Lydia was present at this time, whether she was part of, that group of women praying, which I would think that she would have been, or she was just there passing by and just the right time, right place. But it mentioned that Lydia was already a worshiper of God. She was already a worshiper of God. But the Lord opened her heart to Paul's words. And so when I hear that, I'm thinking of somebody like Cornelius, who already had a strong moral compass, was living by the Old Testament law, he knew God, he respected God and worshiped God, but hadn't yet maybe heard about what it was to be a Christian in the New Testament and Jesus at that point in time. And so we see where Lydia, her heart's open, and then we see where Lydia and her whole household were baptized. And she would have, based on Scripture, was the first recorded Christian convert in Philippi and in Europe. Later on, we see the Philippian jailer and his household as well being converted. When you think about Lydia, and it mentions her household, we're really not given a whole lot of detail about Lydia. We're not told if she's married, if she's divorced, if she's single, if she's widowed. None of that's known. And, Luke, in writing this, doesn't associate her with a man, which in Roman time would have been very abnormal, would have been atypical to the culture. For a woman to be identified without having some kind of connection with her husband. But here Luke does. And so when we see Lydia, and it's mentioning that her household was baptized as well, in the Greek, it means more so just an extended family, which could have included spouses, it could have included children, it could have included household servants and slaves. It could have included some of her business partners and who all she had working for, and other tenants, maybe depending on what all how big her house and property was and all that. But when it's mentioning her as her household, and it's giving her, in a sense, ownership of that household, then you see her as being the authority and the decision maker over its members. And I would assume that she was the household, the head of her household, based on what we're told here in the Scriptures. And so when you're thinking about that from a perspective of looking at Lydia and what her impact was in just a couple of verses, what do you think of Lydia from that standpoint? She was already a worshiper of God. God opens her heart. But then what effect does it have? What effect does it have? It has an effect on her first, but then also to her household, which it could have included who knows how many people. Who knows how many people. And the other thing that's interesting with Lydia is that after her baptism and her household baptism, she urges Paul and Silas and presumably Luke to come into her house and stay in Acts chapter 16 and verse 15. And so by doing that, back in that time, you get this sense of her offering patronage or maybe a partnership in continuing to spread the gospel there in Philippi, which at a minimum would have been a place to lodge, food to eat, maybe clothing to wear. Maybe in a city like Philippi, where there's not a synagogue, and who knows, I don't really know what the Jewish makeup of Philippi was. It would have been a very Roman colony. But you can imagine that maybe even being a part of her household even afforded Paul and Silas and Timothy some degree of protection and status even within that city to be linked to her house. And also allowing Paul and Silas to not worry about where am I going to sleep, where am I going to eat. It allows them to focus 100% on their ministry there in Philippi. And you see even at the end of chapter 16 that Lydia even maybe puts herself on the line with allowing for Paul and Silas to come back. And granted, the Romans were a little scared after they released Paul and Silas from prison, but even allowing Paul and Silas to come back into her home after they were released from prison. And so I think you see a woman that has a very strong leadership characteristic. She is in charge. She leads her family in work, in society, and then also to God. And then you see her offering her services, her protection. Not necessarily protection, but offering her hospitality to Paul and to Silas there. Any thoughts on Lydia before we move on?
Sure does highlight. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sure does highlight what a woman can do, the influence that she can have for the Lord. Like you said, in teaching others, and the influence she has on, we don't know, like you said, we don't know the family per se, but all the people she was surrounded with, the workers that helped her, she has great influence, godly influence on that family.
Right. Well, you can imagine from there, what would her impact have been on the church there in Philippi? Would her house have been the meeting place for them? What you think about how much she would have played in that church. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, going directly along with that, Thyatira is one of the churches that's mentioned later in Revelation. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to imagine that her conversion and the leadership and the support there played a big part in getting that church going, which was Paul's original intent being there in the first place.
Yeah, it's Revelations 3, isn't it?
Yep.
I think is where it's mentioned. So, all right. Let's move on to Phoebe. So if you want to turn over to Romans 16 now at this point, Romans 16. And so Phoebe was a woman that lived in Cenchrea, which is in a region called Achaia. So Cenchrea is over there on the green, blinking yellow box. So a little southwest of Philippi. You can follow the red arrows, where Paul and Silas would have eventually gotten to Cenchrea and Corinth, in that area, after they had been to Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea, and kind of made their way south down the coast. But this, just an interesting side note, but her name means bright, radiant, or pure. That is Phoebe. Like I said, we see her mentioned in Romans chapter 16, verses 1 through 2. Once again, this is the only mention that we have, recorded of her, but I do want to read it. So, Romans chapter 16, verse 1. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church, which is at Cenchrea, that you receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and that you help her in whatever matter she may have need of you. For she herself has also been a helper of many, and of myself as well. Can anybody pick out the three descriptive words or nouns that Paul uses to describe Phoebe?
Servant.
Servant.
She was a sister.
Sister. What else was she? It's at the end of verse 2.
Helper.
She was a helper. She was a helper. And we'll get into this here in a little bit, but while I'm thinking about it, well, we'll get there. So you see this gracious introduction and even this commendation by Paul for Phoebe. And when you see where he first off mentions her as a sister, as a servant, and then as a helper. And it's the same way with Lydia, and even as we're going to get into Dorcas or Tabitha, we're not really told these women's age, their marital status, or any of their other background information other than really the city that they lived in and maybe their character, and with Lydia and Dorcas, what they did. Which I don't think is important necessarily to know all of that stuff. But she leads the list of 26 individuals in various groups that Paul mentions here in Romans chapter 16. And Paul encourages the Christians in Rome to welcome her and assist her in whatever she may need. What are some things that you may think of as to why she was listed first?
Why she was what?
Why she was listed first?
She may have been the one that carried the letter.
Yes, I think that's a strong possibility. Because Paul was in Corinth at the time, which would have been 6 miles away. And so is there a possibility that that Phoebe could have carried that letter to the Romans? I think that's possible. I think that may also be why she's the only one, at least from my perspective, that Paul is commending to the Romans. The other people on the list are Paul is sending their greetings to. What else? I think that's the big one. I think they're in Cenchrea, and then even who knows if she would have had any impact there on the church in Corinth as well. But at least they're in Cenchrea. You see the impact that she has. Obviously, this would have been something that those Christians back then would have more greatly appreciated and understood than we can today. But yes, I think that there is some speculation that she may have carried the letter to Rome. It's not specifically mentioned who, but if she did, then this would have also kind of inked her her status, or her being known there in the early church. And whether true or not, you can see where Paul seems to give her the utmost esteem and great trust in her. And so if she had traveled from Cenchrea or Corinth to Rome, you can see the two red stars. Cenchrea and Corinth is around that red star here at the bottom of Europe. And then you see Rome over there in the top right hand corner or left hand corner. I do want to spend just a few minutes on kind of just touching on how Paul describes Phoebe. So when you think about Paul calling her sister, the Greek word is adelphi, there's only one other woman, and it depends on the translation that you use, that another woman is called sister by Paul in the Bible. Paul uses the term brother over 130 times. He uses that phrase quite frequently. He doesn't use sister as much. It made me think about Mark chapter 3 when Jesus is saying, "For whoever does the will of God, this is my brother and sister and mother." And undoubtedly there would have been many, many more, Christians, brothers and sisters that would have been called that, and probably a very common greeting at that point. But you see that this is an emphasis in this loving and familial bond that is shared between Paul and Phoebe, and probably many others that Paul would have shared with. And it's something that we do. I think a lot of us have that same kind of relationship, with some of our other fellow Christians, maybe not all, depending on the relationship and how well you know them. I remember growing up, like everybody, I grew up in Alabama, so everybody's like, brother, Brother Hawkins or Brother Harrison or Brother Tony, I think the only person I say brother to now is Brother Jim Ward. So, but it's not something that you see as commonly now for us to go up and say sister so-and-so or brother so-and-so. But something that would kind of evoke this special tie that binds you together. And you see Paul intentionally and exceptionally here honoring Phoebe by calling her sister, by recognizing his and hers relationship to God. With the word servant, it comes from the Greek word diakonos. And once again, you see Paul recognizing her service to the church there in Cenchrea. And I think, once again, from these three descriptors would have been kind of her letter of reference as to why she would have been trusted and whatnot to potentially bring the letter to the Roman church. And you get this sense to where she faithfully carried out her responsibilities and her duties to the church and the members there in Cenchrea. Once again, the recognition carries, a certain degree of honor in recognizing, her service. I think it also implies that she had many useful gifts and character as well from that standpoint. I don't want to get off the rails on this, but it is the word diakonos is the term where we get our term deacon for now. I think the Bible is very specific on who can hold the title of deacon in the church. But when you look at the Greek word diakonos, it is both masculine and feminine, servant. And so from that, I would say my takeaway to y'all would be is that all Christians are called to serve, no matter whether you are man or woman. I just think that not all Christians can or will hold a leadership position, so to speak. But I think there are other ways that you can be leaders without having a title. I'll put it that way. And so with that, just take a minute and consider how women serve. Maybe just here in Lost River, here in the church. Think about ways in which the women here serve.
Well, they teach our children.
They teach class. What are some other ways?
Community.
They prepare the community. Yes. What else?
They are kind of behind the scenes doing things like going and visiting people. Not that men don't do hard things. Men can do the hard physical things, but then women have to do the hard emotional things
Yes.
a lot of times.
I would agree with that.
Well, they also serve as the wife of elders and deacons, which is no small matter.
Yes. And so by default, they are, whether they want to or not, pushed into more service or more avenues for service. Yes, ma'am.
Depends on what gift you are and what situation you are in, and can be interpreter and organize the students to study Bible.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
did that before.
Yeah, that's a great point. To be interpreters. Yes.
Well, one thing I think we should take away from this is Paul praised her. How often do we praise the women here that are behind the scenes doing things? How much do we tell people about them? How much they help us?
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
important are they to us?
Yeah. I think there are women even within Lost River that have leadership roles. I mean, there are women that are placed on committees to select teachers. There's women that are on committees to help organize VBS. There are women who organize and direct meals to be sent out for people who have just lost loved ones or have had new babies or people that have been sick. And so even though you may not see a list of women, on the church website or when we used to print out a Sunday bulletin, you have just as many, like as we mentioned, women leaders behind the scenes getting stuff done.
I have a question. Yeah. You might not have that situation here, but in my country, sometimes you will be in a group of people that are new Christians, and those men are not used to say a prayer or anything. So I was asked to lead the prayer before. even though if I don't want to, but
Well.
I just mean, I just mean if the man would be willing to give the authority to the woman, then I think the more experienced Christian woman, yeah, should not turn down that responsibility as well.
I have my opinions on that, and I think I would probably agree with you, but Darrell?
She speaks to something that I've seen
Yes.
quite a lot, as you can imagine. But it's also something that Paul saw. When he went down by the river and saw Lydia with that group of women, they were there worshiping.
Yes.
They came together to pray. It's very common in China to see a group of women together with no men, or with men who know nothing about the Bible, or with men who are not Christians, who are just kind of there. And it's up to the women to do all of it. And then there's this transition period churches will go through from that stage to a stage where men are coming in, and it's kind of an uncomfortable time, as you can imagine, because you've got the women who are the knowledgeable ones, and the men haven't been brought along yet. So their job becomes one of kind of a nurturing role to bring the men along.
Yes.
So there's a lot that we haven't been exposed to here in the U.S., and especially here at Lost River, that happens in other places. Also understand why their influence is so important.
Also, at the time, like you said, we have this nations, elders, and deacons, who's gone from the idea that these elect men and they help them out. So it's interesting. I think over the centuries, we sometimes appoint deacons and then try to figure out, well, what are they going to do? In the New Testament, it seems the motto was more, we got things to do, let's appoint people to do those things.
Amen.
Yes.
And whether someone has the title capital D or lowercase d, at this church, I mean, who's more of a servant than a Heidi or Brianna? I mean, we actually pay these people. I mean, so in that sense, there's a bit of a, and kind of, I think there's a legitimate biblical role for appointing deacons, but we sometimes, I think, make false distinctions that aren't really backed up by Scripture. That these deacons were more about serving than it was about office.
Right. They were doing the job long before they even knew. They were performing what they saw was needed done. They weren't waiting for a title to make it happen. Brett?
I'm just going a little farther with the task of teaching our children. Deeper than that, the women and the mothers in the congregation share the faith so much that I think about our children and how many of them would have abandoned the faith if it wasn't for what was shared with them through the mothers, through the other women in the church, through the teachers. The sharing of the faith, I believe, can you imagine the size of the church worldwide if it wasn't for the women? And Paul encounters that with Lydia. We see the women serving Jesus in his ministry. And without the women sharing the faith as they've done for 2,000 years, I can't imagine the Lord's church existing today, and hardly anyway.
Yes. I agree with that. Yes, ma'am.
I think too, this opens up, us as women, we do a lot of things, like I said, kind of behind the scenes. It's not big out in the open, though it's very well known. But I think it also opens up the thing that women, we have even a bigger role, even outside of the immediate church family. That, like I said, Phoebe could have been a very prominent figure. She was tasked with carrying a letter, more than likely, to many people, many churches around, so people knew who she was. So we can be a more prominent figure and have a bigger part in sharing the gospel outside, like I said, out in the world, then, like I said, and that's just as important as all the day-to-day stuff that we do within the church for our own church family. But I think as a woman, sometimes we've kind of gotten maybe more involved with quote unquote smaller things. It's not small in any means. But have shied away from extending out and being more, not in the public eye necessarily, but in a way, being more that beacon of light out in the world, pointing people back toward the church.
Yes. On Dorcas, she made clothing for widows and poor. She died. Peter raised her from the dead. And everything went happily ever after.